The vinyl of the diner booth was cracked in a familiar geography of fissures and splits, a map of countless mornings just like this one. Arthur Vance traced one of the lines with his thumb. It felt more real, more substantial than the cool, unblemished leather of the chairs in the boardroom he had left behind. Here, in the weak fluorescent light of the Cornerstone Diner, the world was reduced to the scent of burnt coffee, the low murmur of conversation, and the comforting clatter of cutlery on thick ceramic plates. This was the life he had chosen, or rather, the life he had constructed from the ruins of another. His apartment, 2 floors above Henderson's Hardware, cost less per month than the maintenance on a watch he kept in a sock drawer, a watch he never wore. He liked the smell of the place, old wood, dust, and the faint, metallic tang of motor oil from the alley below. It was a simple, honest smell. It didn't try to sell you anything. He had spent 2 decades building an empire that smelled of sanitized air, expensive cologne, and the faint, ever-present scent of anxiety. He preferred the dust. Sarah, the morning waitress, slid a mug in front of him. The coffee inside was dark and strong, a brew designed to wake up truck drivers and farmers, not to be sipped and analyzed. "Morning, Arthur," she said, her smile tired but genuine. "The usual?" Arthur nodded. "Morning, Sarah, please." "Leo's just putting the bacon on now. Said the last batch wasn't crisp enough for you." She winked, a small conspiracy between them. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. Leo. The diner's cook, a man of few words and profound consistencies. Leo had been here every morning for the 3 years Arthur had lived in Oakhaven. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, his movements economical and sure as he worked the grill. He never said much more than a gruff, "Hello," but he always knew. He knew Arthur liked his bacon on the verge of burnt, his toast barely warm, and an extra pat of butter on the side that he never used but appreciated the gesture of. These small, unspoken rituals were the girders of Arthur's new reality. They held him up. Arthur had built a global logistics network, a complex web of ships, planes, and trucks that moved billions of dollars in goods across continents. He had predicted market shifts with uncanny accuracy and negotiated deals that made headlines in papers he no longer read. And yet, the most complex system he now navigated was the quiet understanding with the man behind the counter. That unspoken acknowledgement was a currency he valued more than any stock portfolio. He glanced down at his wrist, a habit he'd never managed to break. The watch was a simple steel Calatrava, its face clean and unadorned. It had been a gift from his mentor, a man who had taught him that the most powerful moves were the ones no one saw coming. The watch was worth more than Sarah's car and a year of her wages combined. It was the one piece of his old life he couldn't discard, a link to the man who had seen something in a hungry kid from the wrong side of the city. To everyone in the Cornerstone, it was just an old watch. He preferred it that way. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The screen read, "Vance Holdings." He pressed the button to silence it and slid it back into his pocket. The call would go to Evelyn Reed, his lawyer, a woman so sharp she could have weaponized a whisper. She handled the remnants of his empire, the trusts and foundations that hummed along without him, ghost machinery he had built and then abandoned. He had walked away from it all the way a man might walk away from a burning building, without looking back, but never quite escaping the heat on his neck. Oakhaven was a town built on such quiet routines. He knew Mrs. Gable from the library, who always saved him the latest biography. He knew Mr. Henderson from downstairs, who could find any screw or bolt you described with your hands. He knew the rhythms of the seasons by the changing conversations at the counter, planting season, harvest, the first snow. He was a part of it, an observer who had slowly, carefully, become part of the observed. He belonged here, even if that belonging was built on the grand omission of who he truly was. The swinging door from the kitchen opened, and Leo emerged, a plate in his hand. He placed it in front of Arthur, bypassing Sarah. 2 eggs, over easy, toast, light, and bacon, crisp to the point of shattering. "Morning," Leo said, his voice a low rumble. "Morning, Leo. Looks perfect." Leo's eyes, a surprisingly light shade of blue, met his for a fraction of a second. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on Arthur's tired face. You look like you didn't sleep." It was a simple observation, not an interrogation. It was the kind of thing you said to someone whose face was as familiar as your own reflection. "Long night," Arthur said, which was true. He'd been up late reading about municipal bond derivatives, a habit as ingrained as brushing his teeth. Leo grunted, a sound that conveyed both sympathy and a dismissal of excuses. He reached over with a coffee pot from the warmer. As he refilled Arthur's mug, the back of his hand brushed against Arthur's. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but the warmth of it was startling. It was calloused, dry, the hand of a man who worked. Arthur felt the ghost of that touch for a full minute after Leo had returned to the sanctuary of his kitchen. He told himself it was just the contrast with the cold ceramic of the mug. He was a master of such small, necessary lies. He ate his breakfast slowly, making it last. This was his contentment. The taste of diner coffee, the low hum of the town waking up, the solid presence of a man who knew how he liked his bacon. It was a small kingdom, but it was his. He had everything he needed, and he had it precisely because no one here knew he could have anything he wanted. The name Arthur Vance meant nothing in this room, and to him, that meant everything. The disruption arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a charcoal gray suit and a smile that didn't reach the eyes. The man's name was Marcus Thorne, and he moved through the diner like he was assessing its value for demolition. His shoes, gleaming black leather, clicked on the worn linoleum with an alien sound. He was followed by two younger men in identical suits, a small pack of wolves scouting new territory. Thorne ignored the counter and took the largest booth, the one usually reserved for the Henderson family on Sundays. He didn't ask. He simply occupied. Sarah approached with a menu, and he waved it away. "Just coffee, black." He said it not as an order, but as a declaration of his own efficiency. Whispers rippled through the diner. Marge, the owner, a woman whose age was etched in the gentle lines around her eyes, came out from the back office. She carried a ledger that looked as old as the town itself. She looked worried. For weeks, rumors had been circulating about a developer buying up properties on Main Street. The old bookstore had closed last month, the owners retiring to Florida with a sudden, surprising windfall. Henderson had mentioned a generous offer for his hardware store, an offer he was reluctantly considering. Arthur watched from his usual booth in the corner, a ghost at the feast. He knew men like Thorne. He had hired them, fired them, and outmaneuvered them on a global scale. Thorne was a vulture from a mid-level private equity firm, Sterling Group. They specialized in acquiring undervalued assets in overlooked communities, stripping them down, and replacing them with franchise chains that bled the local economy dry. They called it revitalization. Arthur called it what it was, pillage. Thorne was holding court, speaking loudly enough for the whole diner to hear. He was talking about progress, about bringing Oak Haven into the 21st century. He painted a picture of a gleaming new Main Street with a brand-name coffee shop where the Cornerstone now stood. "We have to look to the future," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "We can't let sentimentality hold back prosperity." Marge stood by his table, her hands clasped tightly. "This diner has been in my family for 60 years, Mr. Thorne. It's not just a property." Thorne's smile was a masterpiece of corporate pity. "And that's a wonderful legacy, Marge, truly. But a legacy doesn't pay the bills, does it? Our offer is more than fair. It's generous. It's a chance for you to retire comfortably, without the stress of running a business in this changing climate." The threat was veiled, but clear. He was the changing climate. The impact was personal. If the Cornerstone closed, Sarah, a single mother working double shifts to make ends meet, would lose her job. Marge would lose the only home she had ever known. Leo, Arthur's mind snagged on the thought. Leo would be out of a job, his steady hands forced to find another grill, another routine. The thought was surprisingly painful. Thorne's gaze swept the room, assessing the locals, the set dressing for his little drama. His eyes landed on Arthur. He took in the worn flannel shirt, the faded jeans, the quiet man nursing his coffee. Contempt flickered in his eyes, so faint that only someone who had seen it 1,000 times before would recognize it. He saw a relic, a nobody. He gestured vaguely in Arthur's direction. Look, the fabric of this town is important to us. The regulars, the history. We want to preserve that feeling, but in an updated, more profitable model. He spoke about Arthur as if he weren't there, as if he were a piece of furniture, irrelevant.
Arthur met his gaze and held it. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply absorbed the dismissal. It was a familiar feeling. Before the money, he had been dismissed his entire life. He had learned to use it as a shield, a cloak of invisibility. But now, it felt different. It felt like an insult, not to him, but to the life he had so carefully built here. The internal conflict began to churn within him. He could end this. A single text message to Evelyn Reed would unleash a world of legal and financial pain on Marcus Thorne and Sterling Group. He could buy the entire block, the entire town if he wanted to, through an anonymous trust. He could protect these people, but intervention meant exposure. The moment he acted, the invisible walls of his anonymity would crumble. The quiet life of Arthur would be over, replaced by the blinding glare of Arthur Vance. People would look at him differently. Sarah's easy smile would become deferential. Marge's gratitude would create a distance. And Leo? How would Leo look at him? The easy equality of their shared mornings would be gone, replaced by the chasm of $1 billion secret. He would no longer be a friend. He would be a benefactor, a patron, a lie. The cost of staying hidden was watching people he had come to care about suffer. The cost of acting was losing the only thing that made him feel human again. He sat in his booth, a king in exile, debating whether to reclaim a throne he never wanted in the first place. The town hall meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and collective anxiety. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out. Farmers stood in the back, their arms crossed, their faces grim. Shop owners huddled together in the bleachers, whispering. Marge sat in the front row, looking small and fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah stood beside her, a protective hand on her shoulder. Arthur found a spot along the side wall, half hidden by a faded banner celebrating a long-forgotten basketball championship. He was just another face in the crowd, another concerned citizen. Marcus Thorne stood at the podium, a vision of tailored confidence. He spoke of tax revenues and job creation, using charts and graphs to illustrate a future that felt sterile and alien to the people in the room. He framed their resistance as fear, their love for their town as an obstacle to progress. He was slick, persuasive, and utterly contemptuous of the very people he claimed to be helping. "We understand that change can be difficult," Thorne said, his voice oozing a practiced sincerity that made Arthur's teeth ache. "We are offering a lifeline to a town that is, let's be honest, treading water. We are offering investment, opportunity, a future for your children." Marge stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "My diner is not treading water, Mr. Thorne. It's my life. It's where my daughter took her first steps. It's where half this town had their first date. You can't put a price on that." A smattering of applause broke out. Thorne's smile tightened. His gaze scanned the crowd, looking for a target, a way to regain control of the narrative. His eyes found Arthur, standing quietly against the wall, a flicker of recognition, and then opportunity. He pointed, not aggressively, but with the casual authority of a professor identifying a slow student. "Let's take this gentleman right here," Thorne said, his voice booming through the microphone. Everyone turned to look. Arthur felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, a sudden, unwelcome spotlight. "He looks like he's been a part of this town for a long time. A good, honest man who has worked hard his whole life." The description was both technically true and profoundly insulting. Thorne was using him as a prop, the personification of the past he intended to bulldoze. "Sir," Thorne said, speaking directly to Arthur, his tone dripping with condescension. "I know this all seems big and scary, a lot of numbers, a lot of fast talk from city folk, but you have to trust that this is for the best. We can't live in the past forever. Sometimes you have to let go of the old to make way for the new. Do you understand?" The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. It was a public dismissal, a pat on the head for the village elder who couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of modern finance. Arthur felt the heat rise in his neck. He had been belittled by prime ministers, insulted by titans of industry, but this This casual public humiliation in front of the people who knew him as just Arthur felt sharper, more personal. He held Thorne's gaze, his expression unreadable. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all the answer Thorne needed. The developer turned back to the crowd, smug and victorious. But then, a movement from the side. Leo, who had been standing near the gym entrance, his cook's whites covered by a simple jacket, began to walk toward Arthur. He moved with a quiet purpose that cut through the tension in the room. He didn't look at Thorne. His focus was entirely on Arthur. He reached him and stopped, standing between Arthur and the stage, a silent, solid barrier. Leo put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, a physical anchor in a sea of humiliation. "Don't you listen to that snake," Leo said, his voice low and tight with an anger that startled Arthur. It was a protective fury. He wasn't defending a billionaire. He was defending his friend. "You're more of this town in your little finger than he'll ever be." The moment was electric. Leo hadn't shouted. He hadn't made a scene. But his simple, fierce act of loyalty was a louder rebuke than any angry speech. It was a declaration. We protect our own. Thorne, momentarily thrown off his rhythm, tried to recover, but the mood in the room had shifted. The spell was broken. People were no longer looking at Thorne with fear, but with a renewed sense of defiance. Arthur looked at Leo, at the hard set of his jaw and the unwavering solidarity in his eyes. In that moment, the debate within him ended. The cost of his anonymity no longer mattered. The potential loss of this quiet friendship was terrifying, but standing by and doing nothing would be a betrayal of the very thing that made the friendship real. Leo had defended Arthur, the man with nothing. Arthur Vance, the man with everything, would now have to defend him back. Later that night, alone in his apartment, the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was charged. He stood at the window, looking down at the quiet, sleeping street. His reflection stared back at him, a man in a worn sweater, his face lined with fatigue. It was the face of the man Leo had defended. The choice was made. It wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about duty. It was about paying a debt. He had built his fortune to insulate himself from the world, and now he would use it to protect the small corner of the world that had let him back in. He picked up his phone. He didn't dial the main number for Vance Holdings. He dialed a private number, one he hadn't used in 3 years. It rang twice. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I have a project for you." The first move was a whisper, not a shout. From his small apartment, Arthur Vance began to orchestrate a symphony of quiet devastation. His first call was to Evelyn Reed, a woman whose mind operated like a legal scalpel. Her voice, when she answered, was as crisp and dry as old parchment. "Arthur," she said without surprise, "I wondered when you'd get bored of pretending to be a commoner." "I'm not bored, Evelyn. I'm angry," he replied, and the quiet intensity in his own voice surprised him. He gave her the names: Marcus Thorne, Sterling Group. He told her about their tactics, their debt-leveraged acquisitions, their habit of bleeding communities dry. He didn't need to tell her what to do. "Consider it handled," she said. "I'll start with their institutional investors. I believe a pension fund I advise has a significant position. They have a very strict ethics clause. It would be a shame if they were forced to divest due to community engagement concerns." He could almost hear her smile. "And Arthur," she added, "it's good to hear your voice." While Evelyn began to unravel Sterling Group's financial tapestry thread by thread, Arthur turned his attention closer to home. These were not strategic moves. They were acts of quiet restitution. He overheard Sarah at the diner, on the phone with the dental office, her voice tight with worry as she discussed the cost of her son's braces. I don't have it right now," she whispered, her back to the room. "Maybe we can wait another 6 months." The next day, Arthur made a call to a community foundation he'd set up years ago under a different name. An hour later, Sarah received a call from the dentist. An anonymous benefactor, a friend of Oakhaven, had paid her son's entire bill. When she came into the diner, her eyes were bright with tears of relief. She told everyone at the counter about the mysterious kindness. Arthur just sipped his coffee, feeling a warmth that was far more potent than any successful business deal. Marge's ancient 6-burner stove finally gave up the ghost one morning, dying with a sad, metallic sigh in the middle of the breakfast rush. The cost of a new commercial unit was astronomical, enough to put her on the brink of accepting Thorne's offer. 2 days later, a brand new, gleaming stainless steel Vulcan range was delivered to the diner. The delivery slip said it was paid for by a grant from the Main Street Small Business Revitalization Fund. No one had ever heard of the fund. Marge wept with gratitude, her belief in the goodness of people restored. Arthur watched from his booth, feeling like a ghost shaping the world of the living. Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne began to feel the ground shift beneath his feet. It started small. A routine permit application for demolition was suddenly delayed, citing a newly unearthed environmental impact study from the 1970s that required a mandatory 6-month review. Then, his primary investor, a massive real estate investment trust, abruptly pulled their funding, their official statement mentioning a strategic realignment of assets. Thorne knew it was nonsense. He started getting calls from a reporter at a major financial journal. The reporter, a tenacious woman with a reputation for eviscerating corporate raiders, was asking pointed questions about Sterling Group's debt-to-equity ratio and their history of leaving towns worse off than they found them. Thorne was baffled. The resistance wasn't coming from the town hall or the local paper. It was coming from above, from a place he couldn't see. He couldn't identify the source because he couldn't conceive that the source was the quiet man in the flannel shirt he had dismissed as a relic. He was fighting a phantom, an invisible hand that was systematically dismantling his plans with terrifying precision. The campaign took its toll on Arthur. He was on the phone more, pacing his small apartment late at night, speaking in the quiet, decisive language of his old life. The dual identities were beginning to bleed into one another. He was distracted, his thoughts 1,000 miles away even as he sat in his familiar booth. Leo noticed. Of course he noticed. Leo noticed everything. Arthur was late one morning, having been on a pre-dawn call with a banking contact in Zurich. When he finally slid into the booth, his usual plate was already there, kept warm under a metal cover. Leo was leaning against the counter, wiping it down with a cloth, but his eyes were on Arthur. "Everything okay, Arthur?" Leo asked, his voice even. The question was simple, but it landed with the weight of an anvil. It was a question Arthur couldn't answer honestly. "Just fine, Leo. Slept in," he lied, and he hated the way the word felt in his mouth. Leo didn't press. He just nodded slowly, his gaze holding Arthur's a moment too long. The easy silence that had once been a comfort between them was now filled with unspoken questions. A friction had developed, a subtle distance that hurt Arthur more than Thorne's public insults ever could. He was protecting Leo's home, but damaging the foundation of their friendship in the process. He was winning a war, while risking the very thing he was fighting for. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, one that even the strong diner coffee couldn't wash away. The end came, as it often did, not with a bang, but with the quiet delivery of a legal document. Cornered, bleeding investors, and facing a public relations nightmare, Marcus Thorne made a final, desperate play. He called a press conference, right in the middle of the Cornerstone Diner during the lunch rush. His plan was to spin a narrative of a forward-thinking developer being held hostage by a small town's backward sentimentality. He would publicly shame Marge, painting her as the face of obstructionism. Thorne stood near the entrance, a portable podium set up in front of him, a local news camera pointed in his face. He began his speech, his voice filled with righteous indignation. Arthur sat in his corner booth, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He was just part of the scenery again. Leo was in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, his face a mask of thunder. "We came to Oak Haven with an offer of partnership," Thorne declared, "an offer of prosperity. But we have been met with nothing but resistance from a few individuals who refuse to let go of a past that is holding everyone back." He gestured toward Marge, who stood behind the counter, looking pale but defiant. At that moment, a man in a simple courier's uniform entered the diner. He moved past the camera, directly to Thorne, and held out a large portfolio. "Marcus Thorne?" the courier asked. Thorne, annoyed by the interruption, snatched the portfolio. "Sign here, please." Thorne scribbled a signature and ripped open the folder, expecting another legal nuisance. But inside, there was only a single sheaf of papers, bound in blue. It was the deed. The deed to the entire block of Main Street that he had been trying to acquire,
from the hardware store to the old cinema, including the very building he was standing in. All of it had been purchased, in cash, 2 days prior, by a newly formed entity, the Oak Haven Community Trust. Thorne's eyes scanned the document, his confident expression slowly dissolving into confusion. He flipped to the final page, to the signature line for the Trust's sole managing director. He stared at the name, written in clean, decisive ink. He read it once, then again. Arthur Vance. He looked up from the paper, his gaze sweeping the diner in bewilderment. Vance. The name was legendary in his world. Arthur Vance was a ghost, a titan who had built an empire and then vanished. He was a myth. Thorne's eyes finally landed on the quiet man in the corner booth, the man he had used as a prop, the man he had dismissed as a relic. The man was watching him, his expression calm, his eyes holding a depth Thorne was only now beginning to comprehend. Vance? Thorne whispered, the name a strange, foreign sound on his lips. Arthur Vance? The camera turned. The whispers in the diner died. Everyone, Marge, Sarah, Mr. Henderson, the farmers at the counter, turned to look at Arthur. The collective gaze was a physical weight. He was no longer Arthur, their quiet neighbor. He was a name on a legal document, a figure of impossible wealth and power. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as she thought of the anonymous donation for the braces. Marge stared at her gleaming new oven, understanding dawning in her eyes. The man they had pitied, protected, and treated as one of their own was a phantom, and the reality was a stranger they didn't know at all. The community's reaction was a mix of awe, confusion, and a subtle sense of betrayal. The anonymity he had cherished for 3 years fractured and fell away like shattered glass. But none of it mattered. The only reaction he cared about was happening in the kitchen doorway. Leo hadn't moved. He was staring at Arthur, but his expression wasn't one of shock or amazement. It was something far worse. It was hurt. A deep, quiet wound had opened in his eyes. The secret, now exposed, was a chasm between them. It wasn't the money. Arthur knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was the lie. The lie of omission that had sat between them every single morning. In that moment, watching the trust in his friend's eyes curdle into disillusionment, Arthur Vance felt poorer than he had ever been in his life. The victory was total, and it felt exactly like defeat. The aftermath was swift and silent. Marcus Thorne and Sterling Group vanished from Oak Haven as if they had never been there. The story from the Financial Journal broke the next day, a surgical demolition of Thorne's career and his company's predatory practices. Oak Haven was safe. Main Street was secure, its future now in the hands of the community trust Arthur had established and funded. But for Arthur, the world had tilted on its axis. The quiet life he had cultivated was gone. People no longer met his eyes with easy familiarity. Instead, they offered a hesitant, deferential nod. Conversations at the diner counter stopped when he approached. He was no longer a part of the town's fabric. He was the owner of it. The diner booth felt cavernous, the coffee tasted bitter, and the silence around him was no longer comfortable, but empty. He felt the loss of his hidden life like a phantom limb, an ache where something vital used to be. The most profound silence came from Leo. For 2 days, he wasn't there. A replacement cook, a teenager from a neighboring town, worked the grill. The bacon was greasy, the eggs were runny, and the toast was cold. But it was Leo's absence that Arthur felt most acutely. The kitchen door stayed shut. The quiet, grounding presence was gone. Arthur ate his breakfast alone, the food tasteless, the silence in the diner a deafening roar in his ears. He had saved the diner, but lost its heart. On the third morning, Arthur was sitting in his usual booth, staring into a mug of coffee he had no intention of drinking, when the bell above the door chimed. Leo walked in. He wasn't wearing his cook's whites. He was in a simple t-shirt and jeans. He walked past the counter, past the other regulars who fell silent as he approached, and slid into the vinyl seat opposite Arthur. The space between them felt miles wide. Leo didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at Arthur, his gaze steady and searching. He wasn't looking at a billionaire. He was looking at the man he thought he knew, trying to find him in the wreckage of the secret. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He had faced down corporate boards and hostile takeovers without flinching, But this quiet, wounded appraisal from a diner cook was unraveling him. Finally, Leo spoke. His voice was low, devoid of anger, but filled with a profound sadness that was infinitely worse. "You could have told me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a simple, devastating truth. "I keep secrets better than I cook bacon." The words landed, and for the first time in decades, Arthur Vance felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. He blamed the steam rising from his coffee mug. He nodded, unable to form a word. The hurt wasn't about the money. It was about the trust. He had measured their friendship and found it wanting, incapable of bearing the weight of his reality. He had been wrong. Leo held his gaze for another moment, then his expression softened, just a fraction. A flicker of the old understanding returned. He pushed Arthur's coffee mug a little closer to him. "Drink your coffee, Arthur," he said. The use of his name, the simple, unadorned name, was a gift. "It's getting cold." And with that, the crisis passed. It wasn't resolved with a grand apology or a dramatic speech. It was healed in the quiet space of a diner booth, with an unspoken acknowledgement that the foundation between them, while shaken, had held. Arthur stayed. Slowly, painstakingly, a new normal began to take shape. The town adjusted. They learned to see the man again, not just the money. He used the trust to issue interest-free loans to new businesses and scholarships for the local kids. He funded the renovation of the library, but he never attended a board meeting. He managed it all from his laptop, in his small apartment above the hardware store. He was still the man in the corner booth. He just tipped a little more obviously now. He and Leo fell back into their rhythm. The morning greetings, the perfectly cooked bacon, the shared silence. The dynamic had shifted, but it had settled into something new, something honest. The lie was gone, and in its place was a hard-won truth. One morning, months later, Arthur was helping Marge unload a shipment of potatoes, carrying the heavy sacks into the storeroom. It was a simple, physical task, and he enjoyed the burn in his muscles. Leo came back to help, and they worked side by side in the narrow space, a comfortable, wordless team. As they set down the last sack, Leo nudged him with his elbow, a ghost of a smile on his face. "Careful with those, Mr. Vance," he said, the honorific laced with gentle irony. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. The board might have my head." Arthur smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "It's just Arthur," he said, and the ease was fully back, stronger than before. He had built an empire to escape a world that saw him as nothing. He had hidden within that world to escape the empire he had built. In the end, he learned that true wealth was not the freedom to be anyone you wanted, but the courage to be exactly who you were. It wasn't about being seen for what you had, but being known for what you were willing to protect. Sometimes, the most valuable asset a man could possess was a friend who knew all his secrets and still saved him a seat.